Okay, I'm hoping I'm doing this correctly because I finally have this mic and I think I got it to work. And also, since I haven't finished my book yet and I need to read something else to get some inspiration and feedback, I'm gonna read The Stranger, as you've probably seen from the title. And I don't know if this is like restricted that you can't read somebody else's book out loud. I don't know. I guess we'll find out. But I just figured maybe it would be nice to listen to, which is hence the mic. So I'm just gonna get started on some reading, and yeah, let me know in the comments if you like this. And also, maybe this is kind of a type of book that you might like have to read in school or something. I'm not sure. But yeah, let's get started. Recording is going, everything seems fine. Okay, so the book is called The Stranger, as I said, and it's by, hang on a second, what's his name again? Albert Camus. He's a French guy. I've read one of his other books previously, but I've never read this one. So, let's go. Mother died today. Maybe I should put something else up on the screen. Oh, shit, my battery's running out. Okay, I'm just going to start and go until my battery dies. Mother died today, or maybe yesterday. I can't be sure. The telegram from the home says, "Your mother passed away. Funeral tomorrow. Deep sympathy." Which leaves the matter doubtful. It could have been yesterday. The home for aged persons at Marengo, some 50 miles from Algiers. With the 2 o'clock bus, I should get there well before nightfall. Then I can spend the night there, keeping the usual vigil beside the body, and be back here by tomorrow evening. I have fixed up with my employer for 2 days' leave. Obviously, under the circumstances, he couldn't refuse. Still, I had an idea he looked annoyed, and I said without thinking, "Sorry, sir, but it's not my fault, you know." Afterwards, it struck me I needn't have said that. I had no reason to excuse myself. It was up to him to express his sympathies and so forth. Probably he will do so the day after tomorrow, when he sees me in black. For the present, it's almost as if Mother weren't really dead. The funeral will bring it home to me, put an official seal on it, so to speak. I took the 2 o'clock bus. It was a blazing hot afternoon. I'd launched, as usual, at Celeste's restaurant. Everyone was most kind, and Celeste said to me, "There is no one like a mother." When I left, they came with me to the door. It was something of a rush getting away, as at the last moment I had to call in at Emmanuel's place to borrow his black tie and mourning band. He lost his uncle a few months ago. I had to run to catch the bus. I suppose it was my hurrying like that, what with the glare of the road and from the sky, the wreck of gasoline and the jolts that made me feel so drowsy. Anyhow, I slept most of the way. When I woke up, I was leaning against the soldier. He grinned and asked me if I'd come from a long way off, and I just nodded. I keep looking because I'm scared the battery is going to die because it keeps blinking, but it's still going. Let's just keep going. I nodded to cut things short. I wasn't in the mood for talking. The home is a little over a mile from the village. I went there on foot, asked to be allowed to see Mother at once. But the doorkeeper told me I must see the warden first. He wasn't free, and I had to wait a bit. The doorkeeper chatted with me a while I waited. Then he led me to the office. The warden was a very small man with gray hair and a Legion of Honor rosette in his buttonhole. He gave me a long look with his watery blue eyes. Then we shook hands, and he held mine so long that I began to feel embarrassed. After that, he consulted a register on his table and said, Madame Mersault entered the home 3 years ago. She had no private means and depended entirely upon you. That's just like the first page. I'm gonna go charge the battery and let's continue. Doesn't mean I can't still read. I don't really need the camera. So I'm just gonna keep on reading. I hope that's okay. You don't need to see me, you just need to listen, right? Okay, let's continue where we left off. We left off on she had no private means and depended entirely on you. I had a feeling this was blaming me for something and started to explain, but he cut me short. There is no need to excuse yourself, my boy. I looked up the record, and obviously you weren't in a position to see that she was properly cared for. She needed someone to be with her all the time, and young men in jobs like yours don't get too much pay. In any case, she was much happier in the home. I said, yes, sir, I'm sure of that. Then he added, she had good friends here, you know, old folks like herself, and one gets on better with people of one's own generation. You're much too young. You couldn't have been much of a companion to her. That was so. When we lived together, Mother was always watching me, but we hardly ever talked. During her first few weeks at the home, she used to cry a good deal, but that was only because she hadn't settled down. After a month or two, she'd have cried if she'd been told to leave the home, because this too would have been a wrench. That was why, during the last year, I seldom went to see her. Also, it would have meant losing my Sunday, not to mention the trouble of going to the bus, getting my ticket, and spending 2 hours on the journey each way. The warden went on talking, but I didn't pay much attention. Finally he said, now I suppose you'd like to see your mother. I rose without replying, and he led the way to the door. As we were going down the stairs, he explained, I've had the body moved to our little mortuary, so as not to upset the other old people, you understand. Every time there's a death here, they're in a nervous state for 2 or 3 days, which means, of course, extra work and worry for our staff. We crossed the courtyard where there were a number of old men talking amongst themselves in little groups. They fell silent as we came up with them. Then, behind our backs, the chattering began again. Their voices reminded me of pack rats in a cage, only the sound wasn't quite so shrill. The warden stopped outside the entrance of a small low building. So here I leave you, Monsieur Mersault. If you want me for anything, you'll find me in my office. We propose to have the funeral tomorrow morning. That will enable you to spend the night beside your mother's coffin, as no doubt you would wish to do. Just one more thing. I gathered from your mother's friends that she wished to be buried with the rites of the church. I've made arrangements for this, but I thought I should let you know. I thanked him. So far as I knew, my mother, though not a professed atheist, had never given a thought to religion in her life. I entered the mortuary. It was a bright, spotless, clean room, with whitewashed walls and a big skylight. The furniture consisted of some chairs and shelves. 2 of the latter stood open in the center of the room, and the coffin rested on them. The lid was in place, but the screws had been given only a few turns, and their nickeled heads stuck out above wood, which was stained dark walnut. An Arab woman, a nurse, I supposed, was sitting beside the bier. She was wearing a blue smock and had a rather gaudy scarf wound around her hair. Just then the keeper came up behind me. He'd evidently been running, as he was a little out of breath. We put the lid on, but I was told to unscrew it when you came, so that you could see her. While he was going up the coffin, I told him not to trouble. "Hey, what is that?" he exclaimed. "You don't want me to—" "No," I said. He put back the screwdriver in his pocket and stared at me. I realized then that I shouldn't have said no, and it made me rather embarrassed. After eyeing me for some moments, he asked, "Why not?" But he didn't sound reproachful. He simply wanted to know. "Well, really I couldn't say," I answered. He began twiddling his white mustache. Then, without looking at me, said gently, "I understand. Just know that if I'm reading too slow or something, you can always just speed it up. I'll be right back." He was a pleasant-looking man with blue eyes and ruddy cheeks. He drew up a chair for me near the coffin and seated himself just behind. The nurse got up and moved towards the door. As she was going by, the keeper whispered in my ear, "It's a tumor she had, poor thing." I looked at her more carefully, and I noticed she had a bandage around her head, just below her eyes. It lay quite flat across the bridge of her nose, and one saw hardly anything of her face except that strip of whiteness. As soon as she had gone, the keeper rose. "Now I'll leave you to yourself." I don't know whether I made some gesture, but instead of going, he halted behind my chair. The sensation of someone posted at my back made me uncomfortable. The sun was getting low, and the whole room was flooded with a pleasant mellow light. 2 hornets were buzzing overhead against the skylight. I was so sleepy I could hardly keep my eyes open. Without looking around, I asked the keeper how long he'd been at the home. 5 years. The answer came so pat that one could have thought he had been expecting my question. That started him off, and he became quite chatty. If anyone had told him 10 years ago that he'd end his days as a doorkeeper at a home at Marengo, he'd never have believed it. He was 64, he said, and hailed from Paris. When he said that, I broke in, "Ah, you don't come from here." I remembered then that before taking me to the warden, he had told me something about Mother. He had said she had to be buried mighty quickly because of the heat in these parts, especially down in the plain. At Paris, they kept the body for 3 days, sometimes 4. After that, he had mentioned that he had spent the best part of his life in Paris and could never manage to forget it. Here, he had said, things have to go with a rush, like you've hardly time to get used to the idea that someone's dead before you're wheeled off to the funeral. "That's enough," his wife had put in. "You don't ought to say such things to poor young gentlemen." The old fellow had blushed and begun to apologize. I told him it was quite all right. As a matter of fact, I found it rather interesting. What he'd been telling me, I hadn't thought of that before. Now he went on to say he'd entered the home as an ordinary inmate, but he was still quite hale and hearty, and when the keeper's job fell vacant, he offered to take it on. I pointed out that even so, he was really an inmate like the others, but he wouldn't hear of it. He was an official. I'd been stuck before by this habit of saying they, or less often them old folks, when referring to inmates no older than himself. Still, I could see his point of view. As a doorkeeper, he had certain standing and some authority over the rest of them. Just then, the nurse returned. Night had fallen very quickly, all of a sudden, it seemed. The sky went black above the skylight, the keeper switched on the lamps, and I was almost blinded by the blaze of light. He suggested I should go to the refectory for dinner, but I wasn't hungry. Then he proposed bringing me a mug of café au lait, as I am very partial to a café au lait. I said thanks, and a few minutes later he came back with a tray. I drank the coffee, and then I wanted a cigarette. But I wasn't sure if I should smoke, under the circumstances, in Mother's presence. I thought it over, really. It didn't seem to matter, so I offered the keeper a cigarette, and we both smoked. After a while, he started talking again. You know, Mother's friends will be coming soon to keep vigil with you beside the body. We always have a vigil here, when anyone dies. I'd better go and get some chairs and a pot of black coffee. The glare of the white walls was making my eyes smart, and I asked him if I couldn't turn off one of the lamps. Nothing doing, he said. They'd arranged the lights like that. Either one had them all or none at all. After that, I didn't pay much more attention to him. He went out, brought some chairs and set them out, rounded the coffin. On one he placed a coffee pot and 10 or a dozen cups. Then he sat down facing me, on the far side of Mother. The nurse was at the other end of the room, with her back to me. I couldn't see what she was doing, but by the way her arms moved, I guessed that she was knitting. I was feeling very comfortable. The coffee had warmed me up, and through the open door came scents of flowers and breaths of cool night air. I think I dozed off for a while. I was wakened by an odd rustling in my ears. After having had my eyes closed, I had a feeling that the light had grown even stronger than before. There wasn't a trace of shadow anywhere. Every object, each curve or angle, seemed to score its outline on one's eyes. The old people, Mother's friends, were coming in. I counted 10 in all, gliding almost soundlessly through the bleak white glare. None of the chairs creaked when they sat down. Never in my life had I seen anyone so clearly as I saw these people. Not a detail of their colors and clothes or features escaped me, and yet I couldn't hear them, and it was hard to believe they really existed. Nearly all the women wore aprons, and the strings drawn tight around their waist made their big stomachs bulge still more. I'd never yet noticed what a big pouch old women usually have. Most of the men, however, were as thin as rakes, and they all carried sticks. What struck me most about their faces was that one couldn't see their eyes, only a dull glow in a sort of nest of wrinkles. On sitting down, they looked at me and wagged their heads awkwardly, their lips sucked in between their toothless gums. I couldn't decide if they were greeting me and trying to say something, or if it was due to some infirmary of age. I inclined to think that they were greeting me, after their fashion, but it had a queer effect, seeing all those old fellows grouped round the keeper, solemnly eyeing me and dandling their heads from side to side. For a moment I had an absurd impression that they had come to sit in judgment on me. A few minutes later, one of the women started weeping. She was in the second row and couldn't see her face because of another woman in front. At regular intervals, she emitted a little choking sob. One had a feeling she would never stop. The others didn't seem to notice. They sat in silence, slumped in their chairs, staring at the coffin, or at their walking sticks, or any object just in front of them, and never took their eyes off it. And still the woman sobbed. I was rather surprised, as I didn't know who she was. I wanted her to stop crying, but dared not speak to her. After a while the keeper bent toward her and whispered in her ear, but she merely shook her head, mumbled something I couldn't catch, and went on sobbing as steadily as before. The keeper got up and moved his chair beside mine. At first he kept silent. Then, without looking at me, he explained. She was devoted to your mother. She says your mother was her only friend in the world, and now she's all alone. I had nothing to say, and the silence lasted quite a while. Presently the woman's sighs and sobs became less frequent, and after blowing her nose and snuffling for some minutes, she too fell silent. I'd ceased feeling sleepy, but I was very tired and my legs were aching badly. And now I realized that the silence of those people was telling me my nerves. The only sound was a rather queer one. It came only now and then, and at first I was puzzled by it. However, after listening attentively, I guessed what it was. The old men were sucking at the insides of her cheeks, and this caused the odd wheezing noises that had mystified me. They were so much absorbed in their thoughts that they didn't know what they were up to. I even had an impression that the dead body in their midst meant nothing to all of them, but now I suspect that I was mistaken about this. We all drank the coffee, which the keeper had handed around. After that, I can't remember much. Somehow, the night went by. I can recall only one moment. I had opened my eyes and I saw the old man sleeping, hunched up on their chairs, with one exception, resting his chin on his hands clasped around his stick. He was staring hard at me, as if he had been waiting for me to wake. Then I fell asleep again. I woke up after a bit, because the ache in my legs had developed into a sort of cramp. There was a glimmer of dawn above the skylight. A minute or two later, one of the old men woke up and coughed repeatedly. He spat into a big cheek handkerchief, and each time he spat, it sounded as if he were retching. This woke the others, and the keeper told them it was time to make a move. They all got up at once. Their faces were ashen gray after the long, uneasy vigil. To my surprise, each of them shook hands with me, as though this night together, in which we hadn't exchanged a word, had created a kind of intimacy between us. I was quite done in. The keeper took me to his room, and I tidied myself up a bit. He gave me some more white coffee. It seemed to do me good. When I went out, the sun was up in the sky, mottled red above the hills between Marengo and the sea. A morning breeze was blowing. It had a pleasant salty tang. There was the promise of a very fine day. I hadn't been in the country for ages, and I caught myself thinking what an agreeable walk I could have had if it hadn't been for Mother. As it was, I waited in the courtyard under a plane tree. I sniffed the smells of the cool earth and found I wasn't sleepy anymore. Then I thought of the other fellows in the office. At this hour, they'd be getting up, preparing to go to work. For me, this was always the worst hour of the day. I went on thinking like this for 10 minutes or so. Then the sound of a bell inside the building attracted my attention. I could see movements behind the windows. Then all was calm again. The sun had risen a little higher and was beginning to warm my feet. The keeper came across the yard and said the warden wished to see me. I went to his office and he got me to sign some document. I noticed that he was in black with pinstripe trousers. He picked up the telephone receiver and looked at me. The undertaker's men arrived some moments ago, and they will be going to the mortuary to screw down the coffin. Shall I tell them to wait for you, to have a last glimpse of your mother? No, I said. He spoke into the receiver, lowering his voice. That's all right. Tell the men to go there now. That was the end of page 9, and I think it's the end of this recording. And then if anybody wants this, leave a comment and I will keep them coming. I'm gonna be reading this book anyway, so might as well put it out there. Okay, see you in the next one.